The new president had done his best, he confided, to channel him. Adams should read the address as a private letter. Is this exactly in the spirit of the patriarch of liberty, Samuel Adams? Jefferson had asked himself. Is it as he would express it? Will he approve of it? He reached for the essence of republicanism toward a pure expression of the founding ideals. He hoped he might also solicit the counsel of the man he considered the earliest, most active, and most persevering of the Revolution. Adams brushed off the compliments. Indeed, they had survived a mighty storm. It would be some time before prejudice receded and men returned to their senses. He too looked forward to a restoration of harmony, to the triumphs of truth and virtue. As for Jefferson's request for guidance, he demurred. Old men tended to delude themselves when they dredged up lessons from a past that they only dimly remembered. He could volunteer no advice. Samuel Adams offered his blessing.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society and the GBH Forum Network in partnership with Porter Square Books and Massachusetts Historical Society. I'm Margaret Talcott, producer of this series and director of literary programs at American Ancestors NEHGS. All of us behind the scenes are delighted that you're with us tonight in the land of America's history with the celebrated author Stacy Schiff and moderator Ryan J. Woods. On your screen is the schedule for our hour-long event featuring Stacy's new book, The Revolutionary Samuel Adams. Stacy Schiff is the author of numerous award-winning books, including the Pulitzer Prize-winning Vera about Mrs. Vladimir Nabokov. Another one of her titles, Saint-Exupéry, is a Pulitzer Prize finalist. A Great Improvisation, Franklin, France, and the Birth of America earned both the George Washington Book Prize and the Ambassador Book Award. And Cleopatra, A Life, gained the Penn Jacqueline Bograd Weld Award for biography. Her most recent works are The Witches, Salem, 1692, a #1 bestseller, and of course, tonight's featured book, The Revolutionary Samuel Adams. On your screen, you'll see listed the numerous prestigious fellowships she's been awarded. A member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, she was named a Chevalier des Arts et Lettres by the French government. Important for my hometown team, Stacy is also an elected honorary trustee of American Ancestors, NEHGS, and we are so honored that she is part of our organization. Tonight's moderator, backed by popular demand, Ryan J. Woods is Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society. A dedicated researcher, he's contributed genealogical articles and several book forwards for historical and genealogical publications. He is regularly a presenter at related conferences and events. Most important for tonight, Ryan is an appointed member of the Special Commission for the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We're going to be hearing from Ryan shortly, but for now, Stacy, it is such an honor to have you here with the Revolutionary Samuel Adams, which I, as I said, really loved reading. We are so lucky to be able to host you on the very day that the Wall Street Journal named your book one of the 10 best of the year. This with so many other accolades. Thank you so much, Stacy, for sharing your time with us. To get things started tonight, please do tell us briefly about the Revolutionary Samuel Adams. And I think you have some images to share, so I will turn this right over to you. Again, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Margaret. It's a sort of a homecoming for both Samuel Adams and me, and for me to one of my favorite organizations. So I'm really pleased to be here, and thank you all for joining us. I thought I would launch us with a bit of a duet, because at the heart of Samuel Adams's story and the book is a deeply personal animosity, and it in part powers the revolution. Also, shards of it will wind up later lodged indelibly, if somewhat imperceptibly, in our history. So Adams, as some of you know, was a fifth-generation Massachusetts man, the elder son of a prosperous maltster. He grew up on a large estate that fronted the harbor. After Boston Latin, he went on to take 2 degrees at Harvard. This was the usual formation of the New England elite. And there was nothing remarkable about it. And Adams fared rather unremarkably. He distinguishes himself over the first 40 years of his life, really, mostly for his failure to distinguish himself. And possibly for one other thing, he inherited at least some remnant of a fortune, which he proceeded to squander. Which is to say that by the 1760s, the father of 2 children, once widowed and ultimately remarried, he was very popular in Boston, but also very much downwardly mobile. And here you see the portrait of him, with which many of you, I'm sure, are familiar, by John Singleton Copley. I think with the possible exception of Paul Revere, this may be the most shabbily dressed of Copley's subjects. I think that the lapels on Samuel Adams's suit look like they're about to fly off. It doesn't look like a terribly well pressed outfit. And you can see the very simple linen cuffs around his wrists. As Adams, almost precisely 11 years earlier, and a short walk away from Adams's home, was born another 5th generation son of Massachusetts. The family of Thomas Hutchinson had played a role nearly from its start in provincial affairs. Adams entered Harvard at 14, but Hutchinson did at 12. He was a bookish child who also managed, while still a student, to turn his small gift from his father into a considerable sum of money. Elected at 26 to the Massachusetts House of Representatives, he climbed the ranks quickly, traveling to London at 30 to represent the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And here you can see Thomas Hutchinson on that trip to London in what you can also see as a finely embroidered coat. It tells you a very great deal to start with that Hutchinson deserved, or at least could pay for, a portrait in 1741. By contrast, we have no visual proof that Samuel Adams ever had a childhood. He counts among those figures who come down to us middle-aged and gray. So as Samuel Adams makes his way down the social ladder, barely eking out a living, Thomas Hutchinson thrives. He marries well, he invests wisely, he consistently serves in one or the other of the 2 Massachusetts legislative assemblies. And that takes us, after a very early, awkward clash with royal authority, more or less up to the Stamp Act in 1765. Hutchinson has delivered on the promise of his early years. He's by now not only lieutenant governor, but also, among other things, Chief Justice of the Superior Court. Samuel Adams has shifted about, amounting to little, serving in various lowly town offices and running up a great number of debts. Already he had read a line that he would later claim stayed with him throughout his life. He believed that the opinion of the man in the street should not ever be neglected. He fumbled his way toward 2 other convictions that essentially constitute his entire political philosophy. Rulers should have little, he believed, and the people much, and privilege should step aside to make room for genius and industry. All 3 of those convictions put him on a collision course with Thomas Hutchinson. The immediate collision in 1765 was, of course, the one with Great Britain. Both men would object to the Stamp Act. Thomas Hutchinson warned London that it was a miserable idea. Actually, the words taxation without representation were his. The colonies had grown strong only on British neglect. Americans had carved out their homes in a wilderness without Crown support. They could not afford any kind of additional duty. When the time came to oppose the new Revenue Act, however, Hutchinson preferred mildness. He toned down the Massachusetts petition to the Crown. As it was incumbent on him to enforce the law, he could not too much question those laws. The preference for duty over his personal convictions would come back to haunt him, as would his allergy to abstract ideals. Ideas, as he saw it, tended to unsettle government. Meanwhile, resistance built to the Stamp Act. It had been levied without representation and at what was for Massachusetts an economically dismal time. The colonies already felt hamstrung by British restrictions. You could not transport a bolt of wool from one colony to the next, nor could an American printer produce a Bible. As the joke went, an American horse practically needed to be sent to Great Britain to be shod. And now it would be necessary to buy a stamp to affix to pretty much any kind of document you could name. As you may remember, an effigy of a stamp official hung in August 1765. That official happened to be Thomas Hutchinson's brother-in-law, whose home Hutchinson defended late one evening from a mob. Stamp Act resistance only built in Boston over the next weeks, when the talk was all about liberty and property. But there was something else in the air as well, something that would explain the terrible next step. Titles, as I've hinted, tended to gravitate to Thomas Hutchinson. At about this time, John Adams described him with equal parts scorn and envy. To John Adams's mind, Hutchinson was the greatest man in the province, the greatest man on the continent, the greatest man in the world. He was a living paragon on par with Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. Nearly 6 feet tall, gracious and dignified, Hutchinson certainly looked the part. We have his letters to his London tailor, which means that we know a great deal about his pinkish red corduroy waistcoat and the scarlet worsted breeches and the overcoat with the little velvet cape. Half the women in the colony and more than half the men were said to be under his spell. For his part, Hutchinson could not understand why exemplary public service, and he was an exemplary public servant, should annoy others. And yet it seemed to enormously. As Samuel Adams saw it, Hutchinson had, from his 20s, enjoyed every honor and favor in the power of his native country to confer upon him. No one had ever stockpiled so many offices, nor, suspected Adams, would anyone ever again. Thomas Hutchinson held ranking positions in different branches of government. How, asked Adams, could one man simultaneously serve in all three? And Hutchinson had not only claimed the most important provincial offices for himself, but he'd seen to it that the rest of them were distributed among brothers and cousins and in-laws, which meant that around the time of the Stamp Act, it took very little to make Hutchinson's the face of despotism. The stranglehold on power at home came to stand in for what felt like an abuse of power abroad. Was this amazing ascendancy of one family, asked John Adams, anything other than a foundation on which to erect a tyranny? Wherever he could, Samuel Adams kicked up clouds of suspicion in the press, where he had begun to make his mark. Was one family, he asked, not colluding against provincial interests? It didn't help that Thomas Hutchinson was also of the conviction that politics was the business of the elite. It should not and could not, he felt, concern the common man, for whom he had relatively little time. As he later informed the Massachusetts House of Representatives, questions of rights and liberties were far above the reach of the bulk of mankind to comprehend. And he was yet more disdainful of Boston town meetings, to which, as he saw it, anything with the appearance of a man was admitted. On August 26, 1765, another mob descended on Hutchinson's pilastered North End mansion built by his grandfather. Here's a sketch of his home. The family escaped minutes before the doors splintered open and a horde poured in. With axes, they tromped through the cellars to the third floor, slicing through wainscoting, ripping down curtains, and dismantling walls. They hacked beds to pieces. Before the eyes of several thousand spectators and over the course of 8 hours, they gutted the mansion, carrying off pictures, jewelry, silver, clocks, multiple sets of china, Hutchinson's telescope, his microscope, even his servants' apparel. Feathers floated from windows, papers littered the street. One of the most beautiful homes in Massachusetts was reduced to bare walls, its carpets, furniture, garden, and trees demolished. Such ruins were never seen in America, Thomas Hutchinson reported accurately. This is a 19th century depiction of the sacking, which takes some liberties, but gives you an idea of the violence of the evening. Hutchinson made an affecting appearance in court the next morning. He had only the clothes on his back. With God as his witness, and with tears in his eyes, he swore that he had never, directly or indirectly, in New or Old England, encouraged the Stamp Act. Law for all of 5 months and denounced by every American colony, the Stamp Act was never enforced. This is a wildly popular London cartoon in circulation. There's your cartoon. Within hours of the law's repeal, you can see this is Mr. George Stamp bending over the coffin of his favorite child, Miss America Stamp, born in 1765 and dead months later. And one of the flag carriers here is Solicitor General Alexander Wedderburn, who would soon thunder in London that Samuel Adams's writing had introduced Americans to 100 rights of which they never had heard before and 100 grievances which they never before had felt. Everyone hoped that with repeal, the entire unhappy chapter would be delegated to oblivion. As we know, it was not. Tensions eased, and then they mounted, after which London dispatched troops to return Boston to order. But before I invite Ryan to join me, let me just finish quickly with Thomas Hutchinson and Samuel Adams. Hutchinson would sail finally for Great Britain after the destruction of some tea in 1774. Hours after his arrival in London, he was whisked off to brief King George III on American affairs. He informed the king that Samuel Adams was the leader of the opposition. His influence, Hutchinson said, was due to his great pretended zeal for liberty and his inflexible temper. Adams was, Hutchinson told the king, the first to advocate for American independence, a conviction that Hutchinson would hold until his death. Samuel Adams would never see him again, but would outlive him by 23 years. Convinced to the end that American liberties had more to fear from Hutchinson than from any other man in the world, he believed Hutchinson a public executioner of his country's rights. Their antipathy survives them. A number of the charges that Adams leveled against Hutchinson and various causes of the Boston unrest in the 1760s are enshrined in that roundup of injuries and usurpations known to us today as the Declaration of Independence.
Hello, Stacy. Thanks so much.
Ryan, thank you for joining me.
Yes, it is so nice to be with you this evening, and I'm looking forward to our conversation about the revolutionary Samuel Adams and to relaying some of the insightful questions from our many audience members. Let me first add my congratulations. As Margaret noted, I saw today the Wall Street Journal chose the revolutionary Samuel Adams as one of the 10 best books of 2022. And I must say, as someone who reads voraciously, professionally and personally, this is an absolutely outstanding and captivating read. By my count, I think this is your 5th biography, and you've touched on the period of the American Revolution before, certainly in the Great Improvisation, Franklin, France, and the birth of America. What drew you to return to this period and Samuel Adams in particular?
I think there were a number of things which are now so bound up in my mind, I'm not quite sure what the order was, but tonight I'll put them in this order. I had gone back to the Franklin book, partly because it's being made into a mini series, partly because I missed Benjamin Franklin, and someone who I don't think one ever gets quite enough of. And I realized that Samuel Adams had made a cameo in that book. I walked him onto the stage and then walked him off without really thinking much about him. And that sent me to reading his letters in the library, the research library in which I normally work. And I would find myself sort of by 3 p.m. sitting on the floor reading Samuel Adams, for hours. So there was just this sort of off-ramp from Franklin and thinking about how Adams and Franklin had, thinking about the relationship between Adams and Franklin. It was 2016. I think we were all wondering a great deal about America and the origins of America and what the country stood for. And as you know, I had previously written about the Salem witch trials and spent a lot of time wondering how the trials ultimately unravel themselves, how the delusion lifts in Salem in 1692, how the voice of reason finally asserts itself. And one of the most quotable of those voices, one of the most courageous people on the scene at that moment is Thomas Brattle, who's the person who anonymously and very quietly circulates a pamphlet against the witchcraft court, which is a very dangerous thing to do. And there was something of Brattle's steeliness that reminded me of Samuel Adams. There was something of the starchiness and the ability to sort of take an unpopular stand and remain there unwaveringly. And so I think some of those things were feeding, well, both of those things from those two sides were feeding the Adams obsession.
In your opening reading, you lay out this riches to rags trajectory, which is very clearly laid out in the opening parts of the book. And Adams begins to gain some prominence around the Stamp Act of 1765. What are some of the lead-up activities that show his political interests?
He's during those years, the years just before the Stamp Act, polishing his friend's prose. He seems to come to prominence almost as a ghostwriter. James Otis will say that he would give his pages to Samuel Adams to be burnished and polished, and that seems to be his chief occupation with friends. There's an additional piece which probably contributes to his reaction to the Stamp Act, which is the fact that it was an act of Parliament in the 1740s that had ruined his family. His father had been a director of a very short-lived venture called the Land Bank, which was shut down by Parliament, quashed by Parliament in an extremely draconian act, which made the directors of that bank liable for its losses and liable for its debts. And Adams is dragged into this after his father's death. He's expected to make good on the debts. And it would seem that one misadventure would render him a little more sensitive to parliamentary overreach. Certainly some of the things that he writes in these years sound like he is responding directly to the question of who is in charge of American destiny? How much sovereignty does Parliament have any sovereignty over America? Who is meant to actually be administering the colonies? We are a power 3,000 miles away.
You just mentioned James Otis. I'm interested to hear who is in Samuel Adams' orbit. What are his relationships in this period of the 1760s and into the Revolution?
Otis is probably his mentor insofar as he has a political mentor in terms of what we know of his mentors. Otis is 3 years younger than Adams, actually, a brilliant pyrotechnic speaker and lawyer, a man who speaks in blazing full paragraphs and often for hours on end, is the first person really to argue. He argues the writs of assistance case, the first person to really take a stand for American rights. And Adams is somewhat in his thrall and somewhat in his wake during the years where Otis seems to be sort of the chief instigator, the chief opponent anyway of the Massachusetts elite. Very soon, by the late 1760s, the chief incendiary, the restless incendiary, the grand incendiary will no longer be Otis, but will be Adams. So he comes out from under Otis's overcoat in a way. He ultimately, partly because Otis is dealing with some kind of mental illness and does not always seem to argue the same side of the case, Adams will ultimately race ahead and will in fact spend a few years very dutifully and gently cleaning up after Otis, who tends to, in his manic phases or in his outward bursts of energy, tends to offend a lot of people, change his mind constantly, act outrageously in town. So Adams is somewhat there cleaning up after him. He's kind of the wingman and the accomplice and the ghostwriter for years, and ultimately really Otis's best champion. He's very much, though, Adams is very much a recruiter of men. One of his contemporaries will say that if he's remembered for no other reason, he should be remembered as a person who recruited so many to the cause. And among those young recruits are John Hancock, Josiah Quincy, and John Adams, his second cousin.
In the early chapters of the book, you paint this portrait of Hancock as kind of a political weather vane, if you will. Could you speak to the ways in which Adams influenced and recruited Hancock, who perhaps up until your latest work here is much better known?
It's very difficult to find among his contemporaries a kind word for John Hancock. He has political aspirations. It's Adams who ultimately sees to it that he's elected to the Massachusetts House. Adams seems to take the gamble that Hancock, who's very fond of praise and very fond of attention, will enjoy political office, and that the party will very much enjoy Hancock's outsized fortune. He's among the richest men in New England, having inherited a massive fortune at a young age. Hancock is very thin-skinned, easy to take offense. There's one classic letter of Adams's in which he writes to John Hancock and basically says, part of being in politics is being roughed up a little bit. Don't take it so seriously, and tries to calm him. And the two of them will have this very vexed relationship. They're extremely different. Adams is absolutely austere in his personal habits, unwavering and undeviating in his ambitions and in his attentions. And Hancock is a little bit of a political weather vane, not always certain if he really means to be toying with politics, not always completely committed to the cause. They fall out actually in the early 1770s to the point where Hancock swears he never wants to speak to Adams again. Thomas Hutchinson actually exploits that rift and tries to make sure the two of them stay permanently estranged. They ultimately will be reconciled by friends, only to fall out again later. And, as we know, they spent some of the most intimate moments of their life together, hiding in Lexington in 1775. But it's a relationship that is strained largely by the fact that they are two such opposite characters. Hancock likes to parade around town with his liveried servants and his beautiful coach in sartorial splendor. He likes to be he's very benevolent. He's extremely generous with the town of Boston, but he also likes to be thanked for what he's given. And Adams is disapproving of the splendor with which Hancock lives.
And what about Samuel Adams' relationship with his second cousin, John Adams?
It's they're kind of a dazzling duo together. John Adams is a little over a decade younger. It's Samuel again who recruits him. He realizes that John is a brilliant lawyer on the rise. One of the earliest communications from the Sons of Liberty to John Adams, when they would like him to do something for them, ends with a little sort of charming PS, which is, your cousin Samuel sends his regards, sort of to underline the fact that, of course, John is going to do their bidding because Samuel is behind it. They're on very close terms. John and Abigail are very fond of Adams and his second wife, who spend some time visiting them. There's much discussion between the two of them about how much of a threat they actually find Thomas Hutchinson. If anything, John Adams is the greater Hutchinson obsessive. At least he rants more often on the page about Thomas Hutchinson. And they very much see eye to eye and will continue to do so until after the Revolution, when John Adams is much more intent on institutions and how the country is going to hold together. And Samuel Adams is still much more focused on Massachusetts and on individual rights. And they have a very lively 1790 correspondence about what the ideal political architecture should constitute.
I believe that we have a few more images to bring up. We've touched on the Stamp Act. I'm curious to have you speak to some of the tactics that Samuel Adams used as this chief incendiary of the period. And with the occupation of Boston, the arrival of troops in 1768, how does this play into Adams' view of what is possible in pushing back the parliamentary overreach?
Well, I think the actual arrival of those troops, and you can see them parading with great fanfare up the wharf, as they indeed will do, right into the heart of Boston, takes everyone by surprise. As much as everyone has heard troops are en route, nobody really believes that Boston is about to be an occupied town. And it's almost as if Adams has dared this to happen. There's been tremendous unrest. Customs officials have been terrified. The papers are bristling with sedition. It's to put down those attempts that troops are ultimately dispatched. Adams will exploit the arrival of troops, will exploit the occupation of Boston by, with friends, founding a news service, a sort of news syndicate, in which they write up pretty lurid accounts of the soldiers' wrongdoing. Soldiers who are attacking women, soldiers who are caught stealing, soldiers who are profaning the Sabbath, soldiers who are threatening every man, woman, and child in Boston with their bayonets. And they'll dispatch those pieces, the bulk of which appear to be fictitious, to New York and then on to Philadelphia. And then only later will those pieces be printed in Boston, by which time, of course, no one really remembers if those events actually happened or not. But they will, in that respect, very much inflame the town against the soldiers. And during this period, Thomas Hutchinson is really tearing his hair out because of course he's doing his best. Everyone's doing their best to make sure that there is not any friction between soldiers and civilians. And Thomas Hutchinson is betting that if tempers remain this frayed, if there's this kind of inflammatory language, sooner or later, some kind of real violence is likely to break out. And as we know, on March 5th, 1770, that is what comes to pass.
Indeed, with the Boston Massacre in 1770, to the extent that Adams has been treated previously, you're surely aware of the John Chester Miller biography of Adams, which makes this claim that he may have incited the Boston Massacre. Can you speak to that, and more specifically, what Adams really used the massacre for as a tactic to continue to generate support throughout the colony?
So I would say that Adams's use of the massacre occurs afterward. I'm not sure I could make a very strong case. I know there is a case that he incites the massacre, except in the sense that he does keep the town on high alert, as I just mentioned, with all of the propaganda and with all of the insistence that it is an indignity to be occupied by a foreign power, by this case, by soldiers. So, for example, in this Paul Revere engraving, for starters, and first of all, this engraving, as we all know, is a lovely and very familiar fiction. The soldiers didn't fire in a concerted volley like this. The soldiers were up against a brick wall, which is nowhere behind them. None of the victims here is every victim is empty-handed. All the violence is on one side. None of the brickbats, which the civilians seem to have been wielding that night, is in evidence. Nor is there any snow on the ground, for that matter. So you have this just line of soldiers firing into a huddle of sort of martyred civilians, in the middle of which you have a woman wringing her hands. And it's very unlikely any woman would have been out that evening when everyone had been told that something was very likely, something untoward was very likely to happen. So Adams takes this moment and exploits it, and uses it very much to galvanize opinion throughout the Eastern Seaboard, not only in Boston. Part of the influence you can see here, I'm not sure you can see that there's a gun being fired from the customs office, but Adams introduces into this tale, into this history, the idea that the customs officials, who are very much hated in Boston, are complicit in some way with this evening. And he's actually, Paul Revere here will relabel the Customs House Butcher's Hall, and there's a musket being fired out the window, which some witnesses will later claim was a customs officer firing on the crowd as well. So Adams contributes to a great extent to the telling of the story of the evening, to which there are any number of witnesses, but of course no two witnesses see the same thing. And he will make sure that the story lives on. He will do that largely through the massacre oration, which is this extraordinary, immensely poignant annual speech given usually by some rising political star and later published. And as John Adams tells us, the massacre orations were never read with a dry eye. They're extremely profoundly sentimental performances, often having very little to do with the actual evening at hand, but magnifying all of the ill will, and then distributed throughout Massachusetts and elsewhere. So that oration and those publications, and ultimately, actually, the trial itself will be something that Adams exploits to his own to the cause's advantage afterward.
As we move to one of the next major events of the period, with the Boston Tea Party in 1773, what was Adams' role in that event?
We know a great deal about his role at the tea meetings. We have a lot of different snippets of him at the tea meetings, which is to say that when it becomes clear that the ships will not be returning to London, which is the preferred outcome, to accept the tea is to accept the sovereignty of Parliament. To accept the tea is to accept the duty. To accept the duty is to accept accept Parliament's role in legislating for America. Adams really steps in with a bunch of very strong statements Early on, he says that he prefers to he can't trust to the private virtue of his fellow citizens in not drinking the tea, so he prefers to trust to their public virtue in returning it. He's clearly largely in control of some of the meetings which demand of Roach, the owner of the first ship, to attempt to return his vessel. Samuel Adams tries to make an argument that in political tempests, it's possible to leave Boston Harbor without a permit or to override the permitting process. And that Roach has only to say that he's stuck in a howling political tempest and therefore he's entitled to a special permit. That argument doesn't fly with the officials, but it's Adams's idea that it should. When poor Francis Roach will head out to Thomas Hutchinson's house to try in a last-ditch attempt to get a permit to leave, and he comes back, it'll be Adams who will say, "You've done all you could, but nothing more can be done for the salvation of the country." A line which some later historians turned into a sort of detonating line for the destruction of the tea, but which doesn't seem to have been so at the time. And we hear lots of the little sort of aphorisms and the statements and the angry statements that Adams makes in those meetings. At one point, he kind of relentlessly attacks Thomas Hutchinson. At other points, he shares some little allegorical tales about the thirst for liberty. And we know that when the tea is being destroyed, and this is perhaps the most indicative detail we have, when the tea is being destroyed, he and John Hancock and several others, Thomas Young, remain huddled together at the Old South Meeting House, that they are most conspicuously not at the wharf, where thousands of Bostonians are watching the tea sail overboard. And it's almost the very fact that he's not on the wharf that tells us as much as it does. No one in Boston afterward, as we know, has seen a thing, even though thousands of people have watched the destruction of the tea. No one wants to name names. But 12 individuals will be deposed later in London, including Francis Roach. And in those depositions, Adams is always named as among the chief instigators, among the chief leaders of the tea meetings. So obviously not complicit in the destruction, but surely complicit in the planning of those days. He does early on say to his best London correspondent, "If something isn't done, I think I'll be writing you soon about a non-trifling event," which would seem to be the destruction of the tea. And the days afterward, Thomas Hutchinson will say that Adams was never in greater glory. So he doesn't disguise his glee at what has happened, and he does seem to have been there every step of the way. I should say that the Boston Committee of Correspondence, which is sort of his brainchild, and which is communicating with the other towns in the colony and elsewhere, also very conspicuously notes that it transacted no business over these days. And those are the only days where the Committee of Correspondence makes a point of noting that it transacted no business.
Do you have a sense of how Adams felt about the specific tactics of protest? There seems to be some notion that he did not advocate for violence, but what was he looking for his fellow colonists to do?
I think two things are important. One is to stress that very often he's the person who was actually suggesting that violence be tamped down, that patience be the order of the day, that certain things need to be discussed before there should be any action taken. Very often he is the voice of reason. And also that through these years, it's very difficult to say when the word independence really, when independence really becomes an idea that he grasps entirely. But for much of these years, the pursuit is of redress. There's redress of American rights need to be reaffirmed. Parliament needs to understand where American sovereignty begins and ends. There's no discussion of a rupture with the mother country. So there is no real underwriting, no real advocating for violence. There is an absolute affirmation, however, about rights infringed. And a lot of that is really assuming that sooner or later, Great Britain will begin to recognize that itself. The first time Adams actually mentions independence, he mentions it as something that Great Britain should dread. This isn't something on which Americans are fixated. It's something which Great Britain is in its neglect and in its tone deafness itself making happen. which is indeed, I think, arguably the case.
Just before we move into questions from our audience, which I'm seeing now are really fantastic, we have Adams as one of the individuals in Lexington that Paul Revere is going to warn before, of course, the Battle of Lexington in April 1775. And we have this ride somewhat mythically memorialized with Longfellow and such. And yet Adams himself does not appear anywhere in the poem and is sort of lost from popular consciousness. Why is that?
I'm so charmed by that, and it's why the book opens where it does, because I realized sort of with a shock one day that we all know Paul Revere galloping off late at night in April 1775, but I don't think any of us stops to wonder where was he going. And of course, where he's going at the direction of Dr. Warren is to warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who are then in Lexington at the parsonage, that they're about to be either arrested or assassinated. Because in fact, those were the orders, which come from London to General Gage. They're not the orders, it would seem, that General Gage on paper gives to his men. Those orders are to destroy the munitions at Concord. So there's a strange disconnect here between what London was demanding of its commander and what the commander is demanding of his officers. I think Adams escapes from the picture for two reasons. I think Gage was meant to arrest him, had hoped when he first came to America earlier to arrest Adams. Very quickly, he realizes it's too late, that to arrest Adams, to imprison Adams, is to essentially detonate a revolution. And he's not willing to take that step. So there's nothing for him to be gained in actually even mentioning Adams at this point. The order, that part of the order is maybe one he chose to ignore, certainly not one he chose to advertise, even if he does send men out that evening to look for Adams. And for Adams's part, it really was always about principles rather than perpetrators. And he's very recessive as a character. He's as recessive as John Adams is vain. He's immensely invested in being in the background. And he really just slides out of the picture. He's much more interested in the results than he is in any kind of personal glory.
It's not until the 1870s and 1880s that we begin to have some notion of Adams as he appears in statuary in Washington and here in Boston. I believe this is from 1880, nearly 75 years after his death, or more than 75 years after his death. In addition to his own interest in being a background character, what were some of the other factors that led to this period of anonymity, if you will, after the revolution?
Well, these are the years when it becomes possible to put the revolution back into the revolution, when it becomes possible to unsanitize, to actually address some of the rough and tumble tactics and some of the street theater, which of course is Adams's part in the revolution. It's also a moment when the Boston Tea Party becomes a tea party. So it's a moment when this seeming act of vandalism suddenly acquires this kind of folkloric quality of a sort of costumed caper. So it's really the years where you begin to see the revolution from a completely different angle. And you can begin to talk about what happened at the Boston Massacre and the actual people who are involved, as opposed to wanting to rid the stage of the revolutionaries, which I think you need to do after the revolution at first, just to establish a very grounded government.
Jumping into our audience questions, what was the most surprising discovery you made in your research on Samuel Adams?
Oh, that's great. I think one of the things that continues to astound and enchant, we touched on a little bit, which is how strangely decorous and affable and gentle a character he seems to have been. I mean, this man who was willing to basically relitigate the Boston Massacre in the press after the soldiers are exonerated, who essentially writes article after article about how they're actually guilty and how the jurors shouldn't be believed and the judges were misguided, is in fact this very charming, very genteel, in John Adams's wording. He's a man of exquisite humanity, a very sort of charismatic and charming and sweet man. And I think that contrast between the sweet temperament and the hardball tactics was both surprising to me and surprising given what he accomplishes. And I think may explain some of what he accomplishes, because he is clearly has such a tremendous ability to change men's minds. He's clearly such an extraordinary negotiator. And I think that may have helped that sweet temperament.
Do you have a sense of Samuel Adams' relationship with Mercy Warren, for example, and the Committee on Correspondence? And more generally, what was his view on the role of women in this period?
I don't know very much about the relationship with Mercy Otis Warren. He clearly knows her well. It's John Adams who suggests to Mercy Otis Warren after the Boston Tea Party that she write a poem about it. And she essentially writes to him to say, why don't you tell me who the chief perpetrators were, and then I'll write your poem. He never tells her, but she does deliver a poem. She's clearly very familiar to Samuel Adams. She mentions him. She mentions him as among the leaders of the cause, as among the chief patriots. About women, he's very clear, however. He's a huge believer. He's a firm believer generally in education and in there being essentially two pillars on which democracy rests, virtue and education. And he believes that education extends to women as well as to young girls, as well as to young boys. And he makes a point of that repeatedly. His own daughter is very well educated. And his second wife, with whom we have much correspondence, is clearly exquisitely well educated. So that seems to be one of the central tenets for him of a democracy.
Have you seen any false narratives that have been corrected through this work related to perceptions of Adams, such as they existed before this new work came out?
Well, I think that generally if we thought of him, and I don't think we thought of him very often, we thought of him as a firebrand. And so that somewhat different temperament to which his contemporaries attest, I think corrects that image. I think generally he's so behind the scenes that we have underestimated him. I think he's relatively ubiquitous in these years. And we have not, to put him back into the story changes the story of the revolution quite considerably. And leaving him out, which is also, of course, leaving out some of those rough and tumble tactics, somewhat misstates the narrative. I think there's a great deal of originality in what he does. I mean, the committees of correspondence, which he founds, are themselves a rather ingenious institution and probably underrated because their name is so strangely anodyne. I mean, a committee of correspondence just sounds really, extremely vanilla, but it works as a sort of wire among the colonies for one colony and one town to communicate with each other like lightning after Lexington and Concord. So it's an enormously effective institution. I think some of these things have been underplayed because we haven't had Adams in the picture. And I think to a great extent, the behind the scenes negotiating among various patriot leaders looks different when you put Adams back into the story.
We understand today that Adams used a number of pseudonyms in his written works. Was that a safeguard to protect himself, or was this a part of his political tactic to create a larger sense of commitment to liberty?
He has in his toolbox something upwards of 30 pseudonyms. I think in the past, judging from what's been identified before and what I've added, we're at about 30 or 31 pseudonyms, and I suspect there are others that have escaped us. It was pretty much typical for the day for political pieces to appear pseudonymously. It really was just standard operating procedure. Adams raises the bar a little bit in the sense that he's writing as so many people and often simultaneously as different people. Also somewhat misguided, somewhat misleadingly. For example, he sometimes writes a letter from a country, which is actually a letter from Boston, which many people may have realized or not realized. The beauty, of course, of the legion of pseudonyms is, in fact, to have given the idea that opposition, that resistance was more general than it may have been. So the large army of different names certainly helps him, not only disguises what is in fact often sedition or in fact unpopular opinion at times, but also makes it seem as if that resistance is general. There are a few pseudonyms he likes more than others. It's not always easy to figure out why he's Alfred at certain points. I don't know why he's Alfred. When he's arguing against, when he's relitigating the Boston Massacre, he's usually Vindex. So there are times when he pulls out one pseudonym after another. Very often, Thomas Hutchinson and the other Crown officers will assume that a different pseudonymous piece is written by Adams when in fact it's not. So there's not always clarity as to who. It's not certain who's writing as whom, but there are certain pseudonyms which really scream Samuel Adams, and there are certain stances which are very much particular to him.
Some of the questions that are coming in, if we could return for a moment to the Boston Tea Party and to speak to the specific role that he had in leading up to the planning of and what eventually became the event that we know as the Boston Tea Party. Specifically, what was he advocating for?
The idea in sending the tea has in fact relatively little to do with America at the outset. The idea in sending the tea is to bail out the East India Company, which has warehouses that are choking with excess tea. So the idea is, in passing the Tea Act, to restore some kind of financial health to the East India Company, to raise some revenue, to undersell the smugglers in America, to oppose what seems an absurd boycott in America, which exists after the Townsend duties, and simultaneously and incidentally, to slip parliamentary sovereignty into the American drinking water. And it's that last piece that Adams and his colleagues obviously oppose. It's that last piece that makes the arrival of the tea, makes the acceptance of the tea so toxic to them, because to accept that tea is to accept that duty, which is to accept that parliamentary sovereignty. And that is what he's advocating for. He's advocating for the return of the tea, and he will always say that, in fact, Thomas Hutchinson was the one who destroyed the tea, because Adams and his colleagues are doing everything in their power to protect it once it arrives in Boston and to arrange for it to return to London unmolested. And it's Thomas Hutchinson who is the one who basically is unrelenting and won't allow for that to happen, and therefore should bear the responsibility of its destruction.
Can you speak for a moment to your research process in creating this work, and how long were you living with Adams, so to speak?
I lived with Samuel Adams for about 5 or 6 years. The research was largely 3 years of that time. His papers are in the New York Public Library. There's a great deal of additional material elsewhere. That was sort of the first place that I went to and read straight through the papers, and then sort of opened the picture up a little bit and came to the Massachusetts Historical Society, to your fabulous archive. There's material at the Library of Congress. There's lots of little bits of Samuel Adams in the Rhode Island Historical Society in New Hampshire, in Chicago. And then there's an enormous cache of material in London. And it was really at the Public Records Office and at the Parliamentary Archives that I was able to fill in the picture, because so much of what we know of Adams, we know from his enemies. We know from what Thomas Hutchinson or Francis Bernard, the previous royal governor, or customs officials wrote back to London about the activities of Adams and his friends, because obviously these were not activities that Adams was himself committing to paper, which is part of the slipping out of the picture problem. So very often he is best seen through their eyes. And again, some of that is misleading. Sometimes articles are attributed to him which are not his. But for verbatim conversations of, say, Adams and Otis or Adams and Thomas Hutchinson, those papers are hugely helpful. So I did that, and then I went back ultimately again to the New York Public Library to read through the Samuel Adams papers, because now, of course, I could read them with context and with a different set of questions. And then through the Committee of Correspondence papers, which are also in the New York Public Library. And then somewhere along the line there, after about 3.5 or 4 years, I finally started writing.
As we're approaching the end of the hour here, there's a reason that this is one of the best books of 2022. And I believe that you have a passage for us as part of our closing program here, and would certainly invite you to bring that up now.
So this is a piece that was, this was just a couple of paragraphs that really put Adams in the context of his contemporaries. And it's at the end of his life. The most revealing tribute came from Virginia. When in 1800, Thomas Jefferson resumed a correspondence with Adams, the two had not seen each other for years, since, as Jefferson had it, the anxious days we then passed in struggling for the cause of mankind. The storm was over. They were, each congratulated the other, in port. Your principles have been tested in the crucible of time and have come out pure, Jefferson assured his colleague, 32 years after Adams had ventured to suggest that we fight more ardently for our liberty than for all else. At the end of the year, after the ugliest of elections, Jefferson defeated John Adams to become the third president of the United States. For the first time in American history, one political party prepared to hand power to another. In his inaugural address, Jefferson aimed at reconciliation. It was time to banish intolerance and come together with one heart and one mind. America remained, he argued, the world's best hope. Its government was the only one where every man, at the call of the law, would fly to the standard of the law and would meet invasions of the public order as his own personal concern. Differences of opinion should not be construed as differences of principle. No one would have guessed that Samuel Adams, the old Machiavelli of chaos, stood behind those honeyed notes, but there he was. Though delivered to the people of the United States, Jefferson addressed his remarks directly to his venerable colleague. The new president had done his best, he confided, to channel him. Adams should read the address as a private letter. Is this exactly in the spirit of the patriarch of liberty, Samuel Adams? Jefferson had asked himself. Is it as he would express it? Will he approve of it? He reached for the essence of republicanism toward a pure expression of the founding ideals. He hoped he might also solicit the counsel of the man he considered the earliest, most active, and most persevering of the revolution. Adams brushed off the compliments. Indeed, they had survived a mighty storm. It would be some time before prejudice receded and men returned to their senses. He too looked forward to a restoration of harmony, to the triumphs of truth and virtue. As for Jefferson's request for guidance, he demurred. Old men tended to delude themselves when they dredged up lessons from a past that they only dimly remembered. He could volunteer no advice. Samuel Adams offered his blessing.
Stacy, that was spectacular. I love that you were able to bring in Jefferson at the end. And Ryan, a masterful job bringing out this remarkable book. Tremendous thanks to both of you. But to this audience out there, nearly 1,000 of you, thank you. From all of us behind the scenes, we wish you a very good evening and a great holiday season to come. Have a good night.